Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about Quad 2, or what is coming to be popularly known as the Middle Eastern Quad, which consists of four nations: India, US, Israel, and the UAE. Now, before you start wondering what this is about, how different it is from Quad 1, which consists of the India, the US, Australia, and Japan, which is interesting because both India and the US are common denominators of both these groupings. Before I talk to you about this, the differences between the two, what this means, India being a participant both in Quad 1 and Quad 2, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do consider subscribing and paying just a little bit for the Print's free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated journalism. It's only rupees 159. So do click on the join button, pay that money, become a subscriber, and you have access to benefits that non-subscribers don't have. There are also links to subscribe in the description of this video, both for an international audience as well as for a domestic one. So I hope you will click on the join button and become a subscriber to The Print. Now back to my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, which I hope you have read already, and in which I talk about Quad 2, or the Middle Eastern Quad. Now, the four countries that are part of this Quad 2 are, like I said earlier, Israel, UAE, India, and the US. And India and the US are common to Quad 1, which is Australia, Japan, India, and the US, and now Quad 2, which means, and this is very significant, dear viewer, which means that India is now part of two regional groupings which stretch from one end of the Pacific Ocean right to the Mediterranean landmass. Now, this, by any stretch of the imagination, is quite a bit of water and land. So what this means is that India is becoming a part, if you like, of a concert of democracies on the one hand in the Pacific, because you have Australia and Japan, and the US, of course, which is still the world's strongest power. And on the other hand, India is very much part of another grouping in which Israel, of course, a democracy, but also UAE. Now, you cannot accuse the UAE of being a democracy because it's a monarchy. But India's investment and vice versa in the UAE is hugely significant. And you also know, dear viewer, that the UAE has invested a lot of money into India as well. And we will talk about that in this video. So India playing a role in both these groupings. It has a foot in both these groupings, which also means that the world is beginning to recognize that India, large population, a lower middle income country, a poorer country, but still has the bandwidth to be able to influence this particular space, which is on one end of the Pacific Ocean, across the Indian Ocean, and right up to the Mediterranean landmass. So what happened earlier on this week on Monday night was that External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar was already on a visit to Israel. His counterpart, his Israeli counterpart, Yair Lapid, of course, in Israel. His counterpart in the UAE was in his house in Abu Dhabi, which is Crown Prince Abdullah, and the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Washington, D.C., and all these four leaders held a virtual Zoom meeting. Now, who do you think was the elephant in the Zoom room? China, of course. So that's the big common denominator between Quad 1 and Quad 2, because in Quad 1, we know already that all the four countries have come together to constrain, if not contain, China. Now, China is not going to be contained very quickly by any stretch of the imagination, which is why you need Quad 2. And the interesting thing about Quad 2 is that Israel, which is the US's closest ally, head and shoulders above any other country in the world, has also been gravitating towards China. The UAE, also a very close ally of the US. In fact, it's in the UAE that the US has invested large sums of money. It's the monarchy in the UAE has been very pro-West, especially pro-the US, these last several decades. And the UAE was also shifting its influence, its affections in favor of China. So let me show you how in the last few months, ever since the Biden administration come in, there have been a few significant decisions that have been taken in order to arrest this friendship between China and Israel on the one hand and UAE and China on the other. Now, let me give you a certain background to what happened. You know that over the last 10 years, Benjamin Netanyahu, the right-wing leader, was Prime Minister of Israel. A few months ago, he lost the elections, and the new government, led by Naftali Bennett as well as Yair Lapid, took over. External Affairs Minister Jaishankar was in Israel to update the very close India-Israel relationship. And the background to this is that just a week or so ago, on the 13th of October, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, summoned both the foreign ministers of the UAE and Israel. And they decided to form two working groups, one on religious tolerance and the other on water conservation and energy. Now, if you think I'm mixing up a few issues, hold on a second, dear viewer, and let me explain what happened, and all will be clear. So on the 13th of October, Blinken meets the foreign ministers of the UAE and Israel, and they have a very convivial conversation from all records. Just a few days later, this quad, or this informal quad or alliance, if you like, comes into being, with India being added on as the fourth leg of the table. And I already told you about this virtual meeting that happened between these four leaders. So the US understood very, very quickly that China's rise as a global power was having a big impact all across the world, not just in poorer third world developing nations, but also in the backyard of its friendliest country, of its closest ally, Israel. And what happened was that in 2015, Israel sold a section of its busy commercial port, Haifa, to a Chinese company called the Shanghai International Port Group. And this happened under Benjamin Netanyahu. 3 years later, the US Navy wakes up. But of course, it's far too late by then. And the US Navy grumbled and complained that this should not have happened, that this could affect the US-Israel very close security relationship, because, as the US Navy said at the time, that Israel's nuclear submarines were housed in an area very, very close to the section of the port that the Chinese had bought. Again, in 2020, the US complained. The US Coast Guard wanted to inspect this section of the port that the Chinese had bought, and Benjamin Netanyahu refused. I think the US was concerned that the Shanghai Port Group was using this area as a cover for its own or for its country's intelligence operations. Now, of course, we don't know what the truth is, but then Trump loses power and the Biden administration is sworn in. And just a few months ago, look at what happens. The Americans not just push back, not just try and arrest the influence of its primary antagonist, China, but they also trying to claw back influence. So UAE's big company called DP World and Israel Shipyards Industries, which is part of Israel's military industrial complex, come together, form a joint venture, and begin to operate in a section of the Haifa port that lies directly opposite the Chinese-owned section. Now, a website called The Diplomat, from which I've got this information, in fact, has a very interesting line that describes this. In order to create a US-friendly harbor at this critical future transportation hub. So the Americans, realizing what was going on, Netanyahu, under his leadership, believing that business trumps all, had sold this section of the port to the Chinese. The Chinese, we know that it's a one-party communist state, that everything reports to the Chinese Communist Party, that its intelligence operations could have been very much a part of the port that the Shanghai company had bought. And that this was potentially dangerous to the Americans because of the close nature of its relationship with Israel. And Israel, as we know, is the linchpin of America's security strategy right across the Middle East. So DP World and Israel Shipyard Industries formed this joint venture. They buy this other section of the Haifa port. Not just that, they are now beginning to work on a Mediterranean Red Sea pipeline, colloquially called the Med-Red pipeline, which will link Eilat port on the northern tip of the Red Sea to Ashkel on the Mediterranean. Again, this information from courtesy the Diplomat website. Now, just look at what's going on. The whole of the Middle East is being rearranged in a sense. So, as America sheds its millstone that it called Afghanistan for 20 long years, it was embroiled in a country that it hated to fight increasingly, lost a lot of money, lost a lot of treasure, lost a lot of lives. Now, shedding that millstone and trying to again reorganize the world in its own image. And this is exactly what the Chinese are also doing. So this big power rivalry between the US and China at one point of time in the Indian Ocean or in the Indo-Pacific, which is where Quad 1 comes into play in order to constrain or contain China. Of course, India doesn't agree with that description. India wants to believe that Quad 1, of which it is a part, is only devoted to non-military considerations, but other countries think differently. And Quad 2, which is in the Middle East, in this Middle Eastern region stretching from the Gulf across right up to the Arab world, in which both Israel and UAE bookend this coalition, and in order to contain and once again to constrain Chinese influence. And remember, India very, very much part of this coalition. So what happened with the US-UAE relationship? Remember that I was telling you a little bit ago that US and the UAE also had a very, very strong relationship. So over the last few years, once again, as China expanded its trade, its investment, its Belt and Road, remember that the UAE is very much part of China's Belt and Road initiative. Increasingly, a lot of the Gulf kingdoms, all monarchies, presumably they also do not want to interfere in what the Chinese are doing to its own subjects, including Muslim minority Uyghurs. So remember that none of the Gulf kingdoms, including Saudi Arabia, has never said a word to China about the manner in which it treats its citizens, democracy or not. This is clearly of comfort to both China as well as to the Gulf kingdoms. Now, China being this very aggressive trading nation, during the pandemic, what happened was that when everybody needed both vaccines as well as equipment to deal with the COVID crisis, the UAE reached out to an American company called Honeywell, but then America was in bad shape and Honeywell could not send PPE or personal protective equipment to the UAE. So Honeywell, which sources its own a large part of its own equipment from China, where it manufactures PPE, took special permission from Beijing to send PPE kits to the UAE. The Chinese agreed. Soon after, UAE's National Security Advisor Sheikh Tahnoon bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who is the younger brother to UAE's de facto ruler, who is Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, and he is colloquially known as MBZ. So Sheikh Tahnoon, the younger brother, National Security Advisor, formed a joint venture or pushed to create a joint venture with a Chinese firm called BGI to open a coronavirus lab in Abu Dhabi and conduct trials for a vaccine. And you know that subsequently the Chinese vaccines were available in the UAE and people were injecting themselves with a Chinese vaccine. It's only very recently that the US has started sending the Pfizer to Dubai and to other parts of the Emirates. Now, what does this tell you? What it tells you is that China was expanding its influence right in the heart of the Gulf. In fact, there is a Pentagon report on China as a military power, and you'll see that on my column in the Print website, which lists the UAE among nations China may be considering for military logistics facilities. And it became so bad that Anwar Gargash, who is the UAE's presidential advisor, began to accept that this is having a very negative effect on the people of the Gulf, which is that they were forcing, that both the US and China were sort of trying to force the people of the Gulf to choose between either of them. This is bad news for all of us, Mr. Gargash said, and it could be the makings of a new Cold War. But the Americans clearly are not giving up. So what is the message of Quad 2 or the Middle Eastern Quad? The very clear message is as follows. UAE's capital, Israel's technology, and India's inexpensive labor. And America's ability to put all these nations together and to come up with some sort of a potpourri or a whole that is bigger than the sum of its parts in order to constrain China. So these are exciting times, dear viewer, and watch out for more of these coalitions in the making. Nobody's saying that tomorrow, when you wake up in the morning, people are going to, that these are military alliances and that nobody is going to ally with other nations. Each nation, remember, is always going to do things in its own self-interest, in its own national interest. This is what the US is doing, this is what India is doing, as well as Israel and the UAE. But for India, it's a win-win situation because it's not just part of Quad 1, which gives its influence in the Indo-Pacific, but now also of Quad 2. And this is how India's growing intimacy with the US is helping India expand its wings as well as influence across both these parts of the world. So do read my column, Global Print, and let me know what you think of this video. Thank you so much for watching.